the issue of electronic state surveillance has entered the global public consciousness in a way that it hasn't in the past few decades, with the disclosures of Edward Snowden and the journalism and reporting of individuals like Glenn Greenwald, Barton Gellman, and Laura Poitras in The Guardian and The Washington Post. And as our keynote speaker this evening and our speakers this weekend will be talking about, we've now heard numerous stories of different kinds of surveillance that affect our email, our financial records, the diplomatic communications between countries, business information, and more. And one thing that will come out this weekend as well is that though this has recently entered the public debate in a new way, it's been part of the picture for a very long time. It was in the 1970s when the 5 intelligence agencies, electronic intelligence agencies that comprise the countries in the UK-USA agreement first were revealed to the international community. And these include agencies like our own Communications Security Establishment Canada, the National Security Agency, and others across the world. And we have individuals with us here tonight, Thomas Drake and Bill Binney, who have been at the forefront before Snowden and continuing on today at exposing what they feel is illegality and incompetence in organizations like the National Security Agency. But we've also heard a strong response from these agencies and the intelligence community that the surveillance that we've heard about is legal, proportionate, and necessary. And that's why our goal here is to have a critical discussion of these issues. And tomorrow, for example, we'll hear from John Adams, the former chief of Communications Security Establishment Canada, to really hear from different stakeholders on this issue. We decided to have a conference on this subject because we believe that this issue is a defining one of our time. The prevalence of storing electronic data, your information being stored, means that today a baby born will in some ways have their life held on a server. And in Canada, we have a close and long-standing security and intelligence relationship with the United States that necessitates that we have a discussion on this issue. And I'll leave you with one last anecdote before I bring up Joanne this evening, and that's a story that some of you may have read about in the news just this week, published in The Guardian, about a program called Optic Nerve by the Government Communications Headquarters, the GCHQ of the United Kingdom, that has revealed that webcam imagery from 1.8 million Yahoo users, including sexually explicit images, has been collected over the past decade without consent or authorization. So as you can see, the stories coming out of these initial disclosures are still with us today and causing great concern to many. So I'd now like to take a moment to introduce Joanne Davis to say a few words introducing CIC Toronto and our branch, and she is our volunteer branch president. Joanne?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I have to say, this is such an exciting evening. I've been on the executive for a few years, and we've been talking about having a conference for some time. So this is actually the Toronto branch's first of what I hope will be many annual conferences. So we're very excited that this already is such a huge success in terms of the lineup that we've been able to put together, and all of you who are here this evening. There are a few people that I'd like to recognize who are in the audience. First of all, I'd like to recognize Jennifer Jeffs. Jennifer, if you could stand up. She is president of the CIC National Office. And as has been mentioned, I'm a volunteer president. Shaker is also a volunteer on our executive in the Toronto branch. This conference was put together by volunteers. We put on about 15 to 20 events annually to have a dialogue on topics of import to Canadians and foreign affairs. And they're all put together by volunteers. As you can imagine, as anyone could imagine who's put together big events, it's a Herculean task to put together a conference, never mind for it to fall on the shoulders of just a few volunteers. So first of all, I want to take a moment to recognize Shaker Rahim, our conference director, to say what a fantastic job he's done in putting together a really stellar lineup that any organization of any size would be really proud to be putting together. So Shaker. Also, obviously, in terms of the topic, as Shaker has talked about, it is such an important one, which hugely impacts our present and future relationship between ourselves and our state. I'm very interested to hear what our keynote speaker has to say this evening, what our panelists will be discussing tomorrow. I thank you for coming. Enjoy the conference.
So I now have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for the evening, Anne Cavoukian, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. Dr. Anne Cavoukian is recognized as one of the leading privacy experts in the world. Noted for her seminal work on privacy-enhancing technologies, or PET, in 1995, her concept of privacy by design seeks to proactively embed privacy into the design specifications of information technology and accountable business practices, thereby achieving the strongest protection possible. In October 2010, regulators from around the world gathered at the Annual Assembly of International Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners in Jerusalem, in Israel, and unanimously passed a landmark resolution recognizing privacy by design as an essential component of fundamental privacy protection. This was followed by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission's inclusion of privacy by design as one of its 3 recommended practices for protecting online privacy, a major validation of its significance. An avowed believer in the role that technology can play in the protection of privacy, Dr. Cavoukian's leadership has seen her office develop a number of tools and procedures to ensure that privacy is strongly protected, not only in Canada, but around the world. She has been involved in numerous international committees focused on privacy, security, technology, and business, and endeavors to focus on strengthening consumer confidence and trust in emerging technology applications. Dr. Cavoukian serves as chair of Identity, Privacy and Security Institute at the University of Toronto, Canada. She is a member of several boards, including the European Biometrics Forum, Future of Privacy Forum, RIM Council, and has been conferred a Distinguished Fellow of the Ponemon Institute. She is co-chair of the OASIS Privacy by Design Documentation for Software Engineers Committee. Dr. Cavoukian was honored the prestigious Christiane Bettman Award in 2011 for her pioneering work on privacy by design and privacy protection in modern international environments. In the same year, Dr. Cavoukian was also named by Intelligent Utility magazine as one of the top 11 movers and shakers for the global smart grid industry, received the SC Canada Privacy Professional of the Year Award, and was honored by the University of Alberta Information Access and Protection on Privacy Program for her positive contribution to the field of privacy. And lastly, more recently, in November 2011, ranked by Women of Influence Inc. as one of the top 25 women of influence, recognized her contribution to Canada and the global economy. So as you can see, we have quite the stellar woman this evening for us to tell us about this issue, and I would now like to invite up Anne Cavoukian.
I always start with the relationship between privacy and freedom, because that tends not to be easily understood. People tend to think of privacy as a human right at the personal level, which of course it is, but it also has enormous societal value. So we'll talk about that. And then, of course, the obvious, the massive surveillance that we have come to learn about from the revelations of Mr. Edward Snowden. And I have to tell you, I think we owe such a huge debt of gratitude to Mr. Snowden, because while we suspected that there was considerable surveillance being conducted on the part of the state, certainly for me, I never realized the massive scale. And that is what we have directly to thank Mr. Snowden. I have many debates with many individuals who question, is he a whistleblower, is he a traitor? You know where I am on that issue. But there's this wonderful video. Mr. Ellsberg recently spoke at an event. I can't remember what the event was. And he was just so compelling in his praise of Mr. Snowden and his discussion of how if Mr. Ellsberg was trying to do what Mr. Snowden was doing today, that he would not be championed as a whistleblower, but he'd be treated the same way. And it's just so compelling coming from someone like Mr. Ellsberg. But I also want to point out that we should be honored. We have Thomas Drake here and William Binney, formerly with the NSA. And they are remarkable in terms of what they have done. And what unbelievable ordeals they had to endure. I love the round of applause. Just amazing. We sometimes think that we have difficulties in our lives, and from time to time, of course, we do, but nothing on the scale of what they had to endure. And we'll be talking about that. Then, the myth of metadata. If I hear one more person say it's only metadata, I will scream, I often do. But every time I hear it, every single time, we write a letter to the editor, we write an op-ed, I contact the people involved, I challenge it. Every single time, and I urge you to do the same, please, if you happen to encounter this myth, which is just such fiction. Then, a little bit of good news. I hate to leave the audience on a downer. So I like to speak about some of the positives. We'll talk about privacy by design, and I think the hope and promise that it has to offer. Then we'll talk about privacy protective surveillance by design. Is it possible? I think it is. And the reason I put that out there, and I have to thank Mr. Benny so much for his kindly reviewing the paper that we developed. See, when I talk to governments, as I regularly do in organizations, I never want to just offer criticisms. I want to offer solutions. If you just criticize, great. Anyone can criticize. And it's very important, but then what? You've got to offer the something in terms of the then what. And that's what we try to do. So we always take a shot at it, sometimes more successfully than at other times. So let me start by just talking about privacy with freedom. I often start with this slide, and I get some very interesting comments, generally very positive, that people never thought of it quite in those terms. Privacy equals many things. Privacy equals control, personal control over the use and dissemination of your personal data. Privacy equals intimacy, moments of seclusion, moments of reserve. It means many things at the personal level, all of which is true. But what I like to remind people is that it has enormous value at a societal level. When you look at the history of countries that have morphed from free and democratic states into totalitarian states, the first thread to unravel is privacy. That's what the academic literature very clearly demonstrates. So I always say, if you're not concerned about privacy at an individual level, are you concerned about it at a societal level? Do you want to preserve our freedoms? Do you want your children to be raised in freedom? And people say, of course. I said, well, then you've got to take it seriously now. And I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Armenian, and I was born in Cairo, in Egypt. There was a large Armenian population in Cairo. And when I was born, it was under British rule. And my parents used to tell me that they enjoyed enormous freedom, religious freedom. We had our Armenian church, was a Christian church there, and there was never any problem. Everyone lived very cohesively. Then the British pulled out and Nasser came into rule. And at that time, everything changed. The country was nationalized, freedoms were diminished. The banks were nationalized in terms of you couldn't just remove your funds. And my parents, I just applaud them. My parents decided they had to leave. I have two older brothers. I was 4 years old at the time. And they gave up everything. I mean, they had a charmed life there. People had servants. Everyone had wonderful lives. Back then, if you were a mother, you raised your children and took care of your home, and you had a wonderful social life. They had everything. They gave it all up. They had to leave the country literally in the dead of night. My father is a portrait photographer, and Nasser had approached him to become his official photographer. Of course, my dad would have had no choice. And what they didn't want for their children was for their children to be raised in that environment. I'm Armenian. There was an Armenian genocide that their parents escaped from, and they moved to Cairo. So they knew exactly what it meant not to have freedom. And so they literally, in the dead of night, left Cairo, and we came to Toronto, Canada. And I'll never forget, my mother said I had, there was the two of them, my parents, 3 children, and 2 mothers, mother and mother-in-law. There were 8 of us, and there were 8 suitcases. That's what she remembers. They landed here. And they gave up everything. I mean, I just can't imagine how people do that. And so for me, freedom and preserving that is their legacy. And I do that by protecting privacy. And just to remind you a little bit about everything that privacy and freedom are connected to. You cannot have the kind of freedoms that we enjoy, the enormous prosperity, the innovation, the freedom to just conceptualize brand new things that we can't imagine. All of that requires freedom and requires privacy. Surveillance is the complete opposite, the antithesis of privacy. And I say this to you in part as a psychologist. That's my background. I actually did my graduate work here at U of T. I know as a psychologist that when people are being surveyed and they believe they're being watched, everything changes. And this is what I learned from my parents, because they said when the British left and Nasser came into rule, all of a sudden everything changed. Everybody's being quiet in terms of how they're talking. Everybody is looking over their shoulder. Everything changes when freedom walks out the door. So when we talk about your cognitive bandwidth being limited, there's a finite amount of cognition. And where you direct your focus depends on the freedom that you enjoy. And when you are being surveilled constantly, that diminishes. So it's a negative sum. It's a lose-lose proposition. The individual loses, society loses in terms of all of the innovation, the creativity that is being shrunk. So from so many perspectives, I urge you to think of privacy and freedom interchangeably, and that it is a lose-lose proposition if we lose one or the other. So of course we're going to talk about the NSA. The one thing I want to point out, everyone knows what the NSA is, of course, in terms of the relationship to the United States. People seem to be less familiar with CIC, or the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. And what I object to is people pointing their fingers at the NSA, which you should continue to do, but not pointing their fingers at CIC. Canada is just as guilty, if you choose to view it in that light, as the NSA. In fact, possibly more, because believe it or not, there's far less transparency here than there is in the United States. Hard to imagine, completely true. And it embarrasses me as a Canadian. I love being a Canadian. I want to stand up for freedom. And I can't do it as freely anymore. I think Mr. John Adams is going to be here tomorrow, former head of CIC. And I wish I could be there. I'm sorry I can't join you tomorrow, but the day after, I'm leaving for Washington, D.C., and I'll tell you about that in a moment. And I just got to prepare for that. But Mr. Adams, so I've been very critical of CIC, as you might imagine, and I'll explain why. And one of my colleagues, the former Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia, was at a talk where John Adams was speaking. And he apparently referred to me as a tough nut. Now, at first I was insulted because I didn't think that was a respectful thing to do. But David Flaherty assured me that that was in fact a compliment. So you be the judge tomorrow. you find out exactly how that was meant. Oh, did I do something bad? Okay, let me try this one. Okay, Mr. Edward Snowden's revelations. Now, enormous implications, as you might imagine, for everything. National security. Now, you know that there's what they call the Five Eyes, the 5 countries that work together in this intelligence gathering: United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And what I found interesting, in the website or the material you had on your site publicizing this, there was reference to the NSA and to, is it HQ? They're the ones, the NSA equivalent in the UK. But there was no mention of CIC. And I object, because we have to be very transparent and critical of our own. And I assure you, there is so much that we are learning from Mr. Snowden relating to the behavior of our own agency here, right here in Canada. We always think we're forgive me, better than the United States. We do. I mean, let's be serious. You know, we think we know these things, we have more freedom, we enjoy more prosperity. On this one, we should be ashamed. Largely speaking, it's not unique to Canada. The kind of surveillance and the lack of transparency that we are witnessing exists everywhere. The problem is when you have a lack of transparency in society, the whole accountability structure, holding governments accountable for their actions, and citizens are the ones who must do that. How do you do that? How do you hold governments to account when there is no access to their activities? That is the most troubling piece of this. How do you get this information to the public? I always like to remind the government that they are there at the pleasure of the governed. In theory, that's the way it's supposed to be. Increasingly, that's running away from us. And that's what we have to take back. We have to take back control of that which in free and democratic societies is supposed to lie in the hands of its citizens. That is what we have to do. Now this one is what troubled me almost the most. As you know, encryption is used by everyone, companies, governments, individuals to protect data online. They're very strong encryption codes. And what I learned was the co-opting and the weakening of encryption standards in terms of allowing some kind of backdoor was directly in the hands of CIC in 2006. And this just, I found appalling. So there's the International Organization for Standardization, and once a year there's a country in charge. In 2006 it was Canada. Canada was approached by the NSA and quietly asked if they would mind if a backdoor was made available, created for the NSA to access the data. And very quietly, Canada, CIC, permitted this to happen. They allowed the NSA, which means CIC was guilty, because they made it possible to create a backdoor in encryption standards, such that there would be no value in encrypting data in terms of protecting it from the prying eyes of the NSA. And when this story broke, I don't know if it was a few months ago, the crypto community went nuts. I remember Bruce Schneier, who's a dear colleague of mine, a world-renowned cryptographer. He took to the airwaves and said, this is appalling. Fellow cryptographers, we have to take back the internet. We've got to take this back. We've got to develop new code, new crypto that doesn't allow this to happen. And there was such outrage across the board. I was talking to some of my colleagues, to Bruce and others, and the anger was just unbelievable. And I was really pleased to see that, because there was no idea that this was possible. Now, it doesn't mean that it was possible for everything across the board. I was talking to Phil Zimmerman, who developed pretty good privacy, and he's just developed what's called black code, black foam, which is awesome. And I don't think we have it here yet, but it's been released in Barcelona, and it's going to come in the States, and all of your communications will be encrypted on mobile devices. Anyway, I digress. So, outrage at this. But the assumption now is that the NSA can freely access encrypted communications. You gentlemen would know much better than I would. But I think it's a fairly safe assumption, and a very unsettling one, because that's the whole point of encrypting your data. And they're very strong encryption codes. You know, very strong. I mean, obviously there's a continuum, but you can have very strong crypto. But what's the point? It would seem, what's the point? And CIC did other things as well. They allowed spying operations with the NSA in 20 countries. When the G20 came here last year, it's daunting. So I have always valued my privacy. Now, I'm also a public official, so I know I have very little privacy. And now I know I'm on their speed dial. But what concerns me is the implications of this. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, what does CIC say to this? Well, they said, look, no big deal. Did I miss one? No, this was it, sorry. Yeah, they said, no big deal. There's no lawsuit against CIC, challenging them. The British Columbia Civil Liberties Association is taking them to court over these things, and they object to all of the types of things I mentioned, that it is fundamentally a violation of our Charter of Rights and Canadians' freedoms. Now, CIC says, and you have to understand, CIC is a government, they report to the National Department of National Defense, the minister, part of government. There is a commissioner who oversees the activities of CIC. What's the difference between that commissioner and myself in terms of independence and oversight? They say CIC hasn't done anything to violate Canadians' rights. They're completely following the law. We'll talk about metadata in a moment. We're following the law. We're allowed to collect metadata. It's only metadata. We'll talk about that in a moment. And trust me, we're doing nothing to violate the law. Here's the problem. And the CIC commissioner, I'll have quotes from him saying that. Let me contrast my role. I oversee compliance with privacy laws in Ontario at the provincial level, municipal level, and health information. In the States, they have HIPAA, we have PHIPA. So I oversee compliance with that. But I am an independent officer of the legislature. I don't report to the government of the day. I report to the political parties that oversee the legislature. And what that enables me to do is to have complete freedom in terms of if I need to criticize the government, I can do so freely without fear of my budget being restrained or my role being curtailed. I don't report to the government of the day, and that gives me enormous freedom. I don't know if any of you noticed this past summer, I had to write, the media called it, several scathing reports criticizing the government for deleting emails that they were required to preserve, and they're gone. We did very extensive investigations and were extremely critical of the activities of the government. I couldn't possibly do that if I reported to the government or to a minister within the government. The independence, I report through the Speaker to the legislature, enables me to do that. The CIC commissioner, and this is no personal criticism whatsoever in terms of the individuals involved, but the role of the CIC commissioner, he reports to the Minister of National Defense. The Minister of National Defense heads up CIC. What's wrong with this picture? It's circular. Everybody's reporting to the same individual, and that makes it extremely problematic in my view and other people's views. Here are some comments from highly respected academics. Professor Michael Geist talks about the shameful Canadian surveillance silence because we have no transparency. We don't know what's going on. Professor Wesley Wark, we should hang our heads in shame at the current absence of a real debate. And this is the biggest problem we have here in Canada, is getting someone to talk about these things. These professors and a few others have been very critical. I've been very critical, and it's beginning to at least require some kind of response. The response we've been getting is in my view, not acceptable, but we're starting. When you have no transparency, you have no accountability. That's the bottom line. And that's the most difficult piece of this in terms of freedom. When you look into the future, if we don't change things right now, you look at the lives of our children. That's what I fear. That the freedom we enjoy and largely take for granted now will be a fleeting memory for our children and their children. That's why we have to change this. We have to change it now. We have to act and we have to speak up. And one of the problems with Canadians is we tend to be very polite and respectful. These are good qualities, generally speaking. But not at times when you have legitimate reason to be critical and you need answers and you must demand them from your public officials. So that's what we do. What I try to do is we try to be critical publicly. So we write op-eds all the time. Here's one that I wrote with Professor Diebert. Ron Diebert, who you may be familiar with, head of the Munk Center. He's just the most amazing. He heads up the Citizen Lab at U of T, and he's just a remarkable professor and leader and pursuer of freedom. So Professor Ron Diebert, Professor Andrew Clement, Natalie DeRoche, we wrote an article together that when we first learned about the encryption story, or the creation of a backdoor through C6 help, and we went public. Had a lot of good comments from the public. We respond to every email I get, to every phone call. A lot of concerned citizens. Then I did another one, Silence Over Privacy. Then we did another one. I did this one with Professor Adam Levin on what metadata is, and we wrote this. So we do this all the time. I could list 6 more, but I thought maybe give you an idea. We always act whenever we see misinformation, because the public, they're going to believe what they read, largely speaking. I have a great fear of headlines ruling and becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. And so that's why we must challenge. And I have to tell you, I drive my staff crazy, because I read it in the morning and I take the bus to work, and I'm penning the response on the way to work, but then we've got to do it and process it, put it through and get it into the paper. So it's an ongoing process. Now, January 28th of this year, every year, is International Data Privacy Day. And we always do a big thing. We like to do a big thing for it. And what we did this year was big surveillance demands big privacy. But the answer to surveillance isn't you either have surveillance or you have privacy. You have to have situations where you can do both. Because you can't say to the government, we're going to get rid of your surveillance activities. Would that we had the power to do that. Even I think pretty big, but that one's too big to think that that could become a reality. And arguably, you need some surveillance. I mean, nobody wants the bad guys to continue in their pursuits. Nobody wants terrorist activity to develop. I would never say, who would want that? Everyone wants their families to be safe. But you have to find a way that you can have public safety and freedom, public safety and privacy. And these are what I call the positive sum solutions that we always seek. Generally speaking, the approach to surveillance and privacy is zero sum, especially after 9/11. You have a major terrorist activity. Everybody's concerned about public safety. Okay, it's public safety or privacy. Forget about privacy. And in my world, that just doesn't cut it. It can't be this zero-sum either-or proposition where it's going to be one interest or the other. So we try to come up with workable solutions that enable both functionalities to take place. And I'm not suggesting it's easy to do, but the lazy person's way out is zero sum. Zero sum is much easier. You can do one or the other. You pick. It's never, when it's one or the other, it's never privacy that wins. To explore positive sum solutions where you're doing multiple functionalities at the same time, much harder. So what? What could be more important? Let me tell you about another example that we learned about recently. And actually, let me go back to this. So this is January 28th. We had a big event down at the Mars Center. And Professor Ron Diebert was there, and a number of other, we had at least half a dozen speakers. And it was a great event. It was sold out. It was wonderful. All talking about surveillance-related issues. And we're in the green room before the thing starts, and Ron comes up to me, and Ron Diebert, and he says, "You're going to get a call from the CIC. You're not going to believe what they're going to tell you." I said, "What is it?" He said, "I can't tell you. It's embargoed. But you're going to hear really soon, and we'll blow your mind." Okay. So we do the day, and then I go back to the office, and then I've got a couple of interviews. And while I'm doing interviews, the CBC calls my office and embargoed tells my lawyers the story. and says she can't say anything to anybody about it until the story goes live, and we're sending a camera person right now to get her response. And I hadn't heard any of this. I'm doing interviews. I did a webinar as well, and it's International Privacy Day. So I come out of the webinar thing, and I go to the office, and there they all are, and their jaws are dropped, and they're like, "You're not going to believe this." And this was the story, which is now public, so obviously I can talk about it. So we learned that CIC was monitoring the MAC addresses, which are the identifiers of the mobile devices in airports.
It's just a coincidence.
I do that. Oh, there's C6. All right. See? They don't want you to hear about this. Thank you. Let me turn this light off.
It's just that we're filming the numbers of
No problem. No problem. I should get some help.
You look great.
Thank you. So, it turns out that for a 2-week period at Toronto Pearson Airport, and I believe one other, CIC was monitoring, picking up the MAC addresses, your identifiers of your mobile cell phones, your devices, from Wi-Fi zones in the airport. And they did this for 2 weeks, and then once they had the identifiers, they tracked the individuals who were at the airport. Surely some of them were Canadians, and they tracked them for a 2-week period. Their whereabouts, where they went, who they spoke to, all the connections that could be made. These were tracked for 2 weeks. This was what we learned. And again, thanks to Mr. Snowden. Now, this is truly appalling. I don't know about you, I'm at the airport all the time, as are other Canadians. And CIC is not allowed to track the activities of Canadians. They're about foreign intelligence, not the activities of Canadians. And they will tell you at every opportunity that it's against the law to track the activities of Canadians. So once again, we get into semantics. Tracking. Wonder what that means. Before I go there, Professor Dieter, I can't see any circumstance in which this activity I just described would be unlawful. You can't imagine any judge who would authorize it. Professor Wark, he can't see how it fits into C6's legal mandate. How could it possibly be? These are very notable academics. There's Mr. Forrester, chief of CIC. We don't target Canadians at home or abroad in our foreign intelligence activities, because that's all we're permitted to do. Nor do we target anyone in Canada, because it's against the law. And if it's against the law, that means we don't do it. A little circular, the argument. These are the kind of responses that came out. Now, I just want to focus on my favorite subject, metadata. This started in June. So in June, last June, Mr. Snowden started his revelations. And right after that, weeks after that, maybe days after that, President Obama and Senator Dianne Feinstein came up and said, look, it's just metadata. We don't actually listen to the content of your communications, your phone calls, your emails. We don't do any of that. It's just metadata. It's data about data. It's not a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. And at that time, because I was just so outraged, in July, in very short order, that's why I drive my staff crazy or something, we put out a paper right away called a primer on metadata, separating fact from fiction. Because that is exactly what we have to do. We have to set the record straight. And I never ask that you just take my word for it. Take a look. A lot of academic research is in there, a lot of quotes, a lot of individuals. So this is a paper we put out. And the reason we did it was because, so I always do what I call my neighbors test. I have very smart, intelligent neighbors, but they're not in the privacy field. So I went around to my neighbors and I'm saying, so what do you think about this metadata thing? Well, I don't know, they say it's no big deal. It's just metadata, right? They're not listening to my calls. I said, yeah, they're not listening to your calls. Have you ever thought that maybe it might be even more revealing, listening, making the connections to metadata? I don't know what that means. So we draw a picture. And the picture is that the detailed profile of your activities, tracking someone's metadata, the calls you make, the websites you access, the places you visit, your activities, all of this can piece together like pieces of a puzzle and be unbelievably revealing in terms of the information about you, far more revealing than the contents of an actual communication. I'll never forget, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was at a conference and I had the great honor of meeting Dr. Vince Cerf. Vince Cerf with Robert Kahn, they invented the internet. Can you imagine anyone inventing the internet? That they did that. So it was like God to me. Oh, Dr. Cerf. He said, call me Vint. I said, oh, Dr. Cerf, I'm so glad to meet you. Call me Vint. So I finally remembered him. But we spoke about meditating way before this. And he illustrated to me how much more revealing and harmful from a privacy perspective accessing metadata. So that's what we had to do this paper. So I want to dispel this myth, and I ask you please to talk to your friends and colleagues and neighbors and do the same. So here's what they said. This is Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's very, very out there. Of course, our CIC Commissioner, Commissioner Blue, and the Commissioner, I think before him, Mr. Carroll, also commented that it's just metadata and it's not a big deal. We're not accessing communications. Let me tell you one more thing about this. The National Defense Act is what authorizes CIC to engage in their activities. And they repeatedly said, please raise this with Mr. Adams tomorrow, that the Act enables them, authorizes them to collect metadata. So my legal team and I looked through our National Defense Act, and amazing, there's no reference to the term metadata. It doesn't appear in the Act. So how can they be authorized to collect metadata when it doesn't appear in the Act? Oh, but there's something else that appears in the Act. There's something that allows the Minister of National Defense, he can create ministerial directives. These are directives the minister can issue authorizing just about anything he wants. And I don't want to be cavalier about that, but if you take a close look at it, it's not far from the truth. He has enormous power in terms of the ministerial directives that he authorizes. It was in 2006. It was a ministerial directive authorizing metadata. And take a look at it. It's on our website. And it was very interesting because, again, it authorized metadata, describing metadata as being, it's just information about information. We're not accessing the actual communications of Canadians. We're just accessing this amorphous cloud that has been found, in effect. So we are challenging that, and the BC Civil Liberties in their lawsuit, which we are assisting with, are challenging that whole notion that under these directives, you can do this. Now, it was just a fluke that this directive happened to see the light of day. It was also heavily redacted, of course, but at least there was something there. Most of the directives you don't have access to. We have no idea what's going on because there's no transparency. And while I agree that at times there may be some need for secrecy, absolutely relating to certain very sensitive activities, surely you should report to a parliamentary committee that consists of all political parties, not just the Minister of Defense, National Defense, not just the government. That's the problem. It's so circular when the oversight is lacking and it is all kept within the government. So these are just a couple of quotes. I referred to Dr. Cerf's quote that traffic data or metadata can actually be far more revealing than the content of communications. Professor Danny White-Sturgis, a dear colleague, talks about metadata as arguably being more revealing than content, much more easier to analyze, large universe of metadata and correlate with the real-time events. He's just brilliant. So is Dr. Susan Langdale, who talks about the enormous impact of metadata and how the connecting of the dots can be so damaging in terms of the information that is revealed. So I don't want you just to believe me, but I want you to look and convince yourself of the truth of this, because I think it's indisputable. And my hope is that the court, I'm assuming this is going to go to the Supreme Court, because hopefully the BC court will be something, and someone will appeal it, and this will continue. I think we have to have our courts address this issue. And I'm praying that by then, they will have read my primer on metadata, and other pieces of compelling information that will educate them on the importance of these issues in terms of understanding how vital they are. Okay, that's all the negative news. Now we're going to go positive because we have to have some hope. You know, sometimes when I talk like this and I talk to some audiences, I can tell that people are getting so depressed. And I never want to leave you in a negative note because I'm the eternal optimist. I always believe that there are solutions for everything. And believe me, even there are some days it just seems daunting. But there has to be. We have to see our way out of this. We have children. We have children's children. We can't leave society in the hands of what's going on now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about privacy by design, and then I'm going to wrap it up because I think my time is probably up. But I'm going to keep going. Okay, privacy by design is a positive, good news story. You've heard that it was passed in 2010. It's an international standard. And I should tell you, it was unanimously passed by this international community of privacy commissioners and data protection regulators. And at the end we have a conference every year. At the end, there's a closed session. We vote on things. Things are never unanimously passed. The fact that this was unanimously passed told me that everyone's getting the fact that in this world of online social connectivity, ubiquitous computing, mobile devices, Wi-Fi everywhere, massive data collection, we need a different paradigm and one of prevention. And that's what PBD is. And it's become a global standard. It's been translated into 35 languages. And this I'm very proud of because it is literally being followed around the world. If you see a language that you know that doesn't appear there, please come and talk to me afterwards because I always like to expand this. And notice there's Armenian on there. I couldn't not include Armenian if I'm asking you to help me if you happen to have a language that doesn't appear there. The translation process has been done by each of these countries on their own because they are the experts. Here's the essence of it. I refer to zero-sum games and how what a loss that was to me. This is all about get rid of versus substitute and. I talk about the power of and. If you can do multiple functionalities, doubly enabling systems that don't require you to give up law enforcement or give up intelligence efforts. No, you don't have to give up anything. What you have to do is get smart and find ways to do both. Much harder proposition, but eminently doable. 2 years ago, I called it the Year of the Engineer, and I went around the world talking to almost exclusively engineers, software designers, mathematicians, because I wanted to make sure this stuff can be done. You can embed privacy protections into code, into the data architecture. Every single person I met said, of course we can do it. You know, we're smart. And I love that confidence, because you have to be smart to do this stuff. But what they also said is, we got to get this out front at the time we get the instructions to write the code. We can't, you expect us to bolt this on after the fact, after the thing's written? It's not going to work. It's certainly not going to work as well. So then I went around talking to CEOs and boards of directors and senior executives and getting that message across. You have to talk to your crypto guys, to your technicians, to everyone who is pulling this together. You have to talk to them up front at the time the technology is being developed, when it's emerging. I'm going to go through this very fast. 7 principles of privacy by design, all about being proactive, preventing the harms from arising. Because I can tell you as a regulator, there are way too many harms. We investigate privacy complaints like crazy. Very vigilant, we pursue them vigilantly. But the massive number is growing. The harms are growing. We're not going to be able to keep on top of this. I can assure you, no one's budgets are increasing, resources are shrinking. So what do? You go preventative. You prevent the harms. And you do it best by embedding privacy as the default setting in your information technologies, in your business practices, in your operational processes. You embed this in the code as the default. So people don't have to think about it. You can give privacy assurance to your customers, to your citizens. Full functionality, I've talked considerably about. End-to-end security, absolutely critical. Full lifecycle protection. People often confuse privacy and security. Privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone. But if you don't have strong security, you cannot have privacy. It is an absolute essential. So you must have very strong security. visibility and transparency. You gotta keep this stuff open. You collect information from people, they have a right to know what you're doing with it. Who are you sharing it with? Are you asking for their consent before you use it for secondary purpose that were never authorized? If you start with respect for the user and keep it user-centric, the rest will follow. And I always tell businesses, and if you do this, you get what I call privacy payoff. Your customers thank you. They reward you with their continued business and it attracts new opportunity. This is a win-win proposition. So let me bring this around to how does this apply in this area. So we developed a paper called Privacy Protective Surveillance, Achieving Privacy and Effective Counterterrorism. And you might think, they're whistling Dixie, this is going to go nowhere. And I'm not suggesting it's going to go anywhere, but I've been invited twice now by the Department of Defense in the US to speak at the Pentagon on this subject. I'm not suggesting that anything's going to happen, but at least the interest appears to be there. I appeared once with the David Nadeem, the head of PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board in the United States, who talked about privacy by design solutions. So whether it goes somewhere or not, at least there's a starting point for people to consider. That's the important thing. You've got to offer something. You can't, as I said at the beginning, just criticize and then say, well, too bad, you come up with something. You can't do that because they'll tell you there's nothing they can come up with. You have to go to the experts, pull together the story, and then make sure it's tested, as Mr. Binney kindly reviewed this and gave us the feedback. That's what you need to do, and we try to do that. Now, I'm going to keep this really short because I'm already over time. It's all about how do you do surveillance in a privacy protective manner? How do you do it? Well, it's got to be authorized. Authorized meaning judicially authorized. When you have a system where you go to the court, you get a warrant you have reasonable probable grounds to believe that some suspicious activity is happening in terms of terrorist activity. You go to a judge, the judge gives you a warrant, you're golden. So then, once you've done that, you build systems. The system we proposed was one based on artificial intelligence involving, it's called homomorphic encryption. Believe it or not, I love homomorphic. I didn't even know what that was 2 years ago. But the beauty of it is this. Imagine what the NSA is doing, collecting this dragnet of information. There's all this information we believe they're collecting on the public. If you immediately at least encrypt the information, so yes, they have it, but it's encrypted, meaning that it's not accessible in personally identifiable form to all the people at the NSA who are accessing this or others. So the only time the data would actually be decrypted would be if a judge had given you a warrant because he or she was convinced that this particular information you have is worthy of pursuit because there's reasonable and probable grounds to believe it's linked to some terrorist activity. Homomorphic encryption enables you to do analyses on the data, but on encrypted values. So you don't have to decrypt the data before you can do that kind of analysis. And that's the beauty of homomorphic encryption. The data can remain in code and analyses be done. And then once you identify the ones where you do a probabilistic graphical model, meaning what's the likelihood of this guy actually being a terrorist. Use the example of buying a lot of fertilizer. So you think, okay, find all the people who bought a lot of fertilizer. Okay, then what? Well, what do these people do? Imagine the difference between a banker or a professor doing that versus a farmer. Farmers have a very legitimate reason for buying massive quantities. This is a very simple example, but that's the kind of graphical model you would do to develop the probability of the likelihood of someone who bought fertilizer being a terrorist as opposed to a farmer. So these are the kinds of things you would do. If you read the paper, if you feel like it, we go into much greater detail, of course. So I'm not going to go through this because I'll just continue this and I really love to. But I wanted you to know that we've really thought about this and tried to offer solutions. And when I went down to, actually 3 times now in the Department of Defense, we got very detailed, pointed questions, which somehow we managed to answer. So I think this is at least worthy of consideration. talking about how we must, absolutely must, as a free and open society, stop the steady, I call it the creep of surveillance technologies, in terms of having no transparency associated with it when it's conducted by the state. The state, the government, they're there to represent us. They're not, some foreign body imposing things upon us. That's not the way it's supposed to work. We have to insist upon our freedom, and for that we must have some transparency. And that would enable us to engage in holding our governments accountable. When you embed privacy into various systems, it can be information technologies, it can be infrastructure, networked infrastructure, it can be business practices, operational processes, you're ahead of the game because you can anticipate the harms, you can manage the risk, minimize it dramatically, and end with a product that is much more privacy protected than you would otherwise. I've seen this so many times. Go to our website, we have a paper on operationalizing privacy by design. We have 9 different areas in which we've worked. I always work with companies in the field in that area. We've worked with all the leaders, IBM, Microsoft, Intel, HP, Oracle. We've got 2 papers with Oracle on privacy and security by design. BlackBerry. We've worked with all of the leaders in terms of showing that this stuff is doable on the ground now. If it doesn't work now in my world, it doesn't count. So this is what we do, and that's why we partner with companies in the field. If we don't have independent judicial authorization for a lot of the surveillance activities that are now being taken for granted, we're going to lose the game. And I just read today, it made me crazy, that the budget of CIC has apparently, I don't know, more than doubled, some ridiculous amount. Every other budget reported in this article had been cut. CIC is now approaching $1 billion. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is staggering to me. Maybe it's authorized, maybe it's worth it, maybe it's justified. How would we know? How would we ever know if we don't have any idea of what they're doing? We know they recently moved to a beautiful new structure, close to, I don't know, $2 billion is what I've heard. Now we've heard that their budget has been more than doubled. Maybe there's a legitimate reason for that. But without some transparency, we will know nothing. And that's what we have to demand. We have to insist upon that. So write to your MPs, write to your political individuals in your jurisdictions and ask questions. There is a questionnaire already out there. If you go to our website, we will assist you. We need to get answers. And if we don't, I think, do privacy by design now or leave things to chance, what will happen, a German colleague of mine, delightful individual, said we're going to get privacy by disaster, not privacy by design. And we want to avoid that at all costs. And I know I don't have time to do this, but I just want to tell you about this one paper. We're going to be releasing it next week. I'm going to Washington. Stop me if I've already said this. I've been invited to speak at the Congressional Bipartisan Privacy Caucus in Washington, D.C. And I'm delighted because I believe it's the first time a Canadian's been asked to speak here, and they want to know about privacy by design. So I'm really thrilled. We're going to be also launching a new paper there called The Unintended Consequences of Privacy Paternalism. And the reason I'm excited about that is because there is an emerging view, please reject it, that in the world of big data, there can be no privacy. In the world of big data, give up privacy and let's substitute something else. What is the something else we're substituting? So in my world, fair information practice principles are what govern privacy laws and privacy activities. And one of the essentials is called purpose specification. You specify the purpose of a data collection. Government wants some information from you. They tell you why. You give it to them to satisfy that purpose. They're theoretically supposed to only use it for that primary purpose unless they have your consent to use it for a secondary purpose. This new movement is suggesting, in the world of big data, it's all gone anyway. Give up that notion of purpose specification. Individuals can't be looked to know what the purpose is and maintain that. So we're going to give that up, forget about purpose specification, and what we're going to substitute is we're going to hold companies accountable. Companies are going to be the ones that decide on the acceptable secondary uses of your personal data. And then if you don't like it, you can go to the regulator and file a complaint and they'll offer some system of redress. Are you kidding me? This is a negative sum lose-lose proposition. I can tell you as a regulator, I can barely keep up with the volume we have now. It will triple easily if we substitute companies or governments' decision-making as to what an appropriate, unauthorized secondary use is. Not going to happen. Then regulators are not going to be able to manage this. It's just going to go by the wayside. It would be impossible to manage the enormous volume that will come our way. So when I heard about this, it drove me crazy. I immediately contacted one of my dear colleagues in Germany, the Berlin Data Protection Commissioner, Alexander Dix. And I asked him, Alexander, as soon as I told him, I didn't have to tell him, he said, outrageous. I said, would you partner with me in writing a paper opposing this? And he's very strong there, and I'm pretty strong here. Let's really get this going. So we've done that. We're releasing it March 5th. And I can tell you already people are at my throat because they don't like this, the people who would like it to go the other way. So we need a lot of armor. I need a new suit of armor. But we have to fight. Every time our freedoms are curtailed and our privacy is limited, you got to fight back. So join me in fighting back. Thank you.